She did not go back as herself. That was the part no one would ever understand. Not fully, not even later, when everything had come to light and the papers had been drawn up, and the solicitor had stopped looking at her with that particular mixture of pity and embarrassment. She had not walked back through those gates as Lady Eveline Ashcroft, the late Earl's eldest daughter, the rightful heir to Dunmere. She had walked back as Eve, a seamstress from the village, come to take up a position in the laundry. It was the only way in. She had known that for months. Dunmere sat at the end of a long gravel drive flanked by elm trees that her father had planted the year she was born. She remembered standing between them as a child, arms stretched wide, trying to touch both trunks at once. She had never managed it. By the time she was old enough, she had been sent away to her aunt's house in Bath, and by the time her father died, the elms had grown so tall that even a grown man with his arms raised couldn't have reached the lowest branches. She stood at the servants' entrance and kept her eyes down. The housekeeper who answered the door was a compact woman with iron-gray hair and a manner that suggested she had formed her opinion of most people within 10 seconds of meeting them. Her name was Mrs. Brent. She looked Eve over once, the plain dress, the cotton gloves, the small trunk, and stepped aside without a word. That was how it began. The house had changed. That was the first thing she noticed, and it surprised her more than she expected. She had carried Dunmere in her memory for 6 years, like something pressed between the pages of a book, preserved, exact, unchanged. But memory is a liar. The east corridor had been repapered. The old portrait of her grandmother had been moved or removed. She didn't look too long at where it had hung. The smell was different too, less beeswax and more coal smoke, and the windows in the servants' hall were drafty in a way they hadn't used to be. Small things. The kind of things that said, someone else has lived here. That someone was the Duke of Kenworth. She had known he was coming. Everyone in the county had known. The Duke was returning from the continent after nearly 2 years, and the house had been put into a state of anxious preparation for a fortnight. Floors rescrubbed, linens aired, the cellar inventory taken twice. Mrs. Brent moved through the corridors with the focused energy of a general before a campaign, and the rest of the staff moved carefully around her. Eve scrubbed floors and folded linen and said very little, which no one seemed to find remarkable. New housemaids were not expected to have much to say. She was not there for the Duke. She had not even thought much about him. Her father's will had been contested, improperly, fraudulently, she believed, by her father's younger brother, and the estate had passed first to him, and then, upon his death 18 months ago, to his creditors, who had sold it to settle his debts. The Duke of Kenworth had purchased Dunmere at auction. He was not the villain of her story. He was simply the current obstacle between her and the evidence she needed. The letters, the original documents, the proof that her father's signature had been forged on the codicil that had disinherited her. Those documents were in the house somewhere. Her father's old solicitor had told her so before he died. 3rd drawer of the study desk, or what used to be the study. He couldn't be certain they hadn't been moved. She had 3 months, perhaps 4, before anyone connected her name to her face. After that, the risk became too great. She told herself this was a practical arrangement. She was practical, she had learned to be. The Duke arrived on a Thursday afternoon in November, when the sky was the color of pewter and a wind was coming off the moor that cut straight through wool. She was in the upper corridor when he came in, carrying a stack of freshly pressed pillowcases that she was supposed to deliver to the East Wing. She stopped at the top of the stairs. She didn't mean to watch, but the entrance hall was directly below, and the sound of the doors opening carried, and then there were voices. The steward, Mrs. Brent, and a man's voice underneath both of theirs, quieter and more clipped. She looked down through the banister rails. He was taller than she had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. She had heard things, the way one hears things in a house. The cook had a niece who worked for a family that knew the Kenworth set, and according to that niece, the Duke had gone to the continent after some kind of trouble, though the nature of the trouble varied depending on who was telling it. A broken engagement, said one version. A duel, said another. A matter of money, said a third, though no one who said this seemed to know whose money or what the matter had been. He handed his coat to the footman without looking at the footman. He said something to Mrs. Brent that made her nod twice in rapid succession. Then he looked up, not at Eve. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just the house, the ceiling, the old chandelier that her father had brought back from France before she was born. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide about, not admiring it, assessing it. Then he turned and walked toward the study. Eve shifted the pillowcases in her arms and went on about her work. She learned his schedule within the first week, because that was simply what happened when you lived in a house. You learned its rhythms, and its master's rhythms were part of that. He was up before the rest of the household most mornings, or at least before the maids. She would see the study light burning when she passed the door at 6 in the morning, going to collect the ashes from the upstairs grates. He took his meals alone. He did not receive visitors, though several had apparently called, and Mrs. Brent had turned them away on his instruction. He walked in the evenings, when the light was going and the grounds were mostly empty. She saw him twice from the laundry window, once crossing the south lawn, once standing at the edge of the kitchen garden, very still, his back to the house. He had the manner of a man who had come home from somewhere difficult and was not yet ready to be back. She recognized it in a distant way because she had felt something like it herself, that particular dissonance of standing in a place that should feel familiar and finding that you are the thing that has changed, not the place. But she did not let herself think too much about him. She had her own purpose. The study was the problem. It was never empty. Either he was in it or it was locked. She had found this out the second night, when she had slipped downstairs at 11:30 with her heart in her throat and a candle she couldn't light until she was sure no one was watching. The door handle had not turned. She had stood there in the dark for a long moment, and then she had gone back upstairs and lain awake until 4 in the morning. She would find another way, or another time. She was patient. She had learned that too. It was the third week before he spoke to her directly. She was at the end of the east corridor, re-hanging a curtain that had come loose from its rod. One of the other maids had knocked it while dusting and hadn't said anything. And Eve had noticed it, pulling at a strange angle, and stopped to fix it. She had her arms up, trying to work the ring back onto the rod, when she heard footsteps and turned. He was standing perhaps 5 feet away, watching her. She stepped back and dropped into the small curtsy the station required. "Your Grace." He looked at the curtain. "Has Mrs. Brent asked you to do that?" "No, Your Grace. I noticed it was loose." He looked at her then directly, in a way that was not rude, but was entirely frank. People with titles often had that quality, the ability to look at a person without the usual social softening. She kept her face composed and her eyes appropriately lowered. "What's your name?" "Eve, Your Grace, Eve." He said it without emphasis, as if he was noting it somewhere. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks, Your Grace." He nodded once and walked on. That was all. She finished rehanging the curtain and went back downstairs. And she did not think about the steadiness of his gaze or the fact that she had held her breath for the entire 30 seconds of that conversation. She was practical. She had learned to be. The person she had not accounted for was Philippa Rowe. Philippa Rowe was the Duke's cousin, or rather, she presented herself as the Duke's cousin, though Eve gathered from overheard fragments that the connection was more precisely through marriage and several steps removed. She arrived in the 4th week with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and a manner that suggested she had decided, some years ago, that the world owed her constant and enthusiastic attention. She was beautiful in a way that people in paintings were beautiful, symmetrically, dramatically, with the kind of coloring that an artist would choose on purpose. And she was perfectly pleasant when she was in a good mood, which was most of the time, because she arranged circumstances to suit herself, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it since childhood. Within 2 days of her arrival, she had reorganized the morning room, redirected the cook's standing orders for breakfast, and made it very clear, through a series of small, impeccably executed social maneuvers, that she considered herself the natural mistress of Dunmere. She was there for the Duke. Everyone in the house understood this, in the way households understand things, without anyone saying it plainly. Eve watched her and felt something she carefully didn't name. Philippa called him Rowan. She was the only one in the house who did. The rest of the staff addressed him as Your Grace, the steward as My Lord. Even his own correspondence came addressed to the Duke of Kenworth. But Philippa swept into rooms saying, Rowan, I've been thinking, and Rowan, you really must come and look at this. And the name sat strangely in Eve's ear, like a word in a language she almost but didn't quite speak. She was not jealous. She had no reason to be jealous. She was a housemaid with a secret agenda, and he was a duke. And even if she had been Lady Eveline Ashcroft in full standing, the situation would have been complicated at best. She scrubbed the kitchen flagstones and reminded herself of this, systematically, until it stopped needing reminding. She found the letters on a Tuesday, in early December, when the first snow had come down overnight, and the house was muffled and still. The study had been left unlocked. She still didn't know why, whether someone had simply forgotten, or whether the Duke had been called away in a hurry. And she had been walking past with a basket of mending when she saw the door standing 2 inches open, and simply stopped. Her heart had hammered once, hard, and then gone very quiet. She put the basket down. She listened. The house was empty in that particular way it got on cold mornings, when everyone was occupied somewhere else. She pushed the door open and went in. The desk was a large walnut piece that had been her father's, and she felt the shock of it in her chest. The smell of the wood, the particular brass fittings on the lower drawers, the faint ring on the leather surface where her father's inkwell had sat for 20 years. She had stood at this desk as a child in this same room, watching him write, thinking that she would never understand grown-up things. She had understood more than she'd known. 3rd drawer on the left. The solicitor had said so. She opened it. There were papers, several packets of them, bound with red ribbon in the way legal documents were bound. She went through them quickly, with hands that were steadier than she felt. Estate surveys, a correspondence with a London bank, a household inventory from 1891, and then, beneath the inventory, a smaller envelope, unsealed, her father's name on the front in handwriting that was not her father's. She opened it. The papers inside were not complete. There was a gap, something missing, a page that had been removed or lost. But what remained was enough. The original will, in her father's handwriting, with his signature and the date. The codicil that had altered it bore his name but not his hand. She had grown up watching him write. She had studied it later out of grief, and she knew the difference the way she knew the difference between her own heartbeat and someone else's. She was standing there, holding the papers, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. There was nowhere to go. She put the papers back, closed the drawer, and turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room. Nowhere near the door, nowhere near anything that a housemaid would plausibly be, when the Duke walked in. He stopped. They looked at each other. She watched him take in the scene, the closed drawer, her position in the room, the absence of any basket or cleaning implement. The fact that she was simply standing there in the middle of his study, with her hands folded and her chin up, because she had made a decision in the 3 seconds before he appeared that she was not going to apologize or dissemble. "Eve," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral. "Your Grace." She let a beat pass. Then she said, "I owe you an explanation." She told him most of it. Not all of it. Not the part where she had lain awake for 6 weeks, where she had lain awake for weeks working out how to get into this room. Not the part where she had sat in a rented room in the village for 3 months before that, telling herself this was possible, that she was not chasing something that didn't exist. But she told him the essentials: her father, the codicil, the handwriting she didn't believe was his, the solicitor's deathbed account of where the documents might be. He listened without interrupting. He had that quality too, the capacity for genuine stillness, the kind that didn't feel like absence but like attention. When she finished, there was a long silence. "You've been here for 6 weeks, he said. "Yes. Under false pretenses, yes." He walked to the desk. He looked at the drawer she had closed. He didn't open it, just looked at it for a moment, the way he had looked at the chandelier that first afternoon, as if he was working something out. "Why didn't you come to me directly?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you had no reason to believe me. I had no proof of who I was, and the people with the best motive to discredit me were the ones who had contested the will in the first place. If I had come to you as Lady Eveline Ashcroft and told you the estate had been improperly transferred, you would have referred me to your solicitor, who would have referred me to a legal process that has already failed me once." He was quiet for a moment. "And you found what you were looking for." "Enough. Not everything. There's a page missing." He opened the drawer. He looked through the papers she had described. He found the envelope, took out the contents, examined them with the focused attention of a man who had spent time reading documents that mattered. Then he set them down on the desk. "I know about the codicil," he said. She stared at him. "Not that it was forged. I didn't know that. But the auction was irregular. My solicitor noted it at the time. I was told the irregularities had been resolved." He looked at her steadily. "It appears they had not been. What followed was not simple. Nothing involving property and titles and forged documents was ever simple, and she would have been naive to expect it to be. There were solicitors from London, and a barrister's opinion, and a great deal of correspondence, and at least one meeting that lasted 4 hours and left her with a headache that took 2 days to fully clear. Philippa Rowe left at the end of the first week of December, with her 2 trunks and her lady's maid, and without a great deal of ceremony. Eve did not witness her departure, but heard about it afterward, in the way one heard about things in a house. Philippa had apparently expressed, with considerable feeling, her view that the Duke was making a significant error of judgment. The Duke had apparently listened to this without much visible response, which seemed to be his manner with most things he had already decided about. Eve continued to stay in the servants' quarters, because there was nowhere more practical to go, and because she was not yet Lady Eveline in any official sense, and because she was not entirely certain what she was supposed to be in the meantime. She avoided him when she could. This was the honest truth, and she examined it the way she examined things she didn't like about herself. Directly, without excuses. She avoided him because she had been in his house for 6 weeks under false pretenses, and he knew it, and there was something exposed about that fact that she hadn't expected. She had thought she was practical. She had thought she had prepared herself for every version of this. She had not prepared for the version where he looked at her, as though he was genuinely trying to understand something, and she found she had nothing to hide behind. He did not avoid her. That was the thing she noticed. He did not go out of his way to seek her out. He wasn't obvious about it, but neither did he pretend she was invisible, which would have been the easier thing to do and what most men in his position would have chosen. He nodded when they passed in the corridor. He stopped once on the landing to ask how the meetings with the solicitor were progressing. He asked as if he actually wanted to know, not as if he was being polite. She answered him honestly. She didn't know how to do anything else anymore. It was a Thursday evening when she finally stopped pretending she had everything arranged in tidy, manageable order. She was in the library, the old library, the one at the back of the house that didn't get much use and smelled of dust and the particular papery damp of books that had been loved a long time ago. She had gone there because it was quiet and because the East Wing room she was still occupying was cold, and because she had been holding herself together with her own two hands for long enough that she needed a few minutes without anyone looking at her. She sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the grounds, where snow was coming down again, in the slow, indifferent way of someone who has all the time in the world. She had grown up in this house. She had read in this library. She had sat in this exact chair, or one very like it, when she was 7 years old and her father had come in and found her there with a book she wasn't supposed to have yet and had sat down on the footstool beside her and read it with her instead of taking it away. She had not cried about any of this, not when the will was contested, not when the case was dismissed, not when the solicitor died, and she thought she had lost the last thread of it. She had been too busy being practical. She was crying now, very quietly, in the way one cries when one has held off for too long and the body simply insists. She did not hear the door. "I should have knocked," he said. His voice was low, not alarmed but careful. "I didn't know you were here." She turned her face toward the window and pressed the back of her hand against her cheek. "It's your library. At the moment it seems to be yours." She almost smiled at that. She heard him cross the room, not toward her, but to the other side, where the bookshelves were, and she heard the quiet sound of a book being taken down and replaced. He was giving her time. She understood that. After a while, she turned back around. He was standing by the shelves with his hands in his pockets, not looking at her, looking at the spines of the books in that same calm way he had of looking at things. "I sat in this chair when I was 7, she said. "My father came in and found me reading something I wasn't meant to yet. Gibbon, I think, or something near it, and instead of taking it away, he sat down and read it with me." She paused. "He said I might as well learn to read difficult things young, because they didn't get easier later." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he was right. Yes. She looked at her hands. He usually was. He came and sat, not beside her, but in the chair across, the distance of a hearth rug between them, the snow going on outside. And they sat there for a while, not saying much, while the house settled around them in the way old houses do. It took 4 more months for the legal matter to resolve. There were setbacks. One document that turned out to be a copy, rather than an original, a witness who had to be located in Edinburgh. A procedural delay from the Chancery Division that added 6 weeks to a timeline she had already stretched to its limits. She stayed. There was no practical alternative, and she had stopped pretending that practicality was the only reason. He had asked her to stay, that much was true, in the straightforward, uncircuitous way he had of saying things. He had come to find her after a meeting with the solicitors in March, when the air was finally beginning to smell like something other than cold, and said that however it resolved, she was not going to leave Dunmere with nowhere to go, and that she was welcome as long as she needed. She had looked at him for a moment, long enough that she saw something shift slightly in his expression, a watchfulness, the careful attention of a man who was asking a question with more than words, and she had said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and he had almost smiled. "Rowan," he said, "if it isn't too much." It was the first time she had heard his name without Philippa Rowe attached to it, and she found it sounded entirely different. "Rowan," she said. The title was restored in May on a Wednesday, with less ceremony than she had imagined. There was a letter from London, and then a visit from a solicitor who seemed relieved rather than triumphant, and then paperwork that took most of the afternoon and made her hand ache from signing. The estate itself remained legally complex. There were entailments and encumbrances and questions of debt from her uncle's tenure that would take another year to fully untangle. But her identity was restored. Lady Eveline Ashcroft was, once again, officially herself. She sat at the desk in the study, her father's desk, which she had touched only twice since the night she was discovered, and looked at the documents in front of her. There was a knock at the open door. He was leaning against the frame, watching her with that quiet, direct attention that she had spent 8 months learning not to look away from. "Done?" he asked. "Done." He looked at the papers, then at her. "How does it feel?" She thought about it. "Like putting a bone back in place," she said. "It hurts, and then it's a relief, and you realize you'd gotten used to walking wrong." He came into the room then, all the way in, and stopped at the edge of the desk and looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand meant he was about to say something he had been thinking for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask. It may complicate matters. The legal situation is already complicated." "I've managed complicated," she said. His mouth curved, not quite a smile but close to it, the expression she had been cataloging without meaning to since November. "Yes, you have. A beat. I'd like you to stay." She looked at him steadily. "In what capacity?" "In every capacity," he said. "If you're willing." The snow was long gone. Outside, through the study window, the grounds were green again. The elm trees her father had planted, sending out their May leaves in that particular pale, urgent green of early spring. She had not been able to touch both trunks at once, as a child. She thought that she should go out and try again, one day, now that she was here. She looked at the man standing on the other side of her father's desk, in the house that was hers again, asking her in the only way he seemed to know how. Directly, without performance, with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to waste time on things that didn't matter. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing," and that was that. Not the end of the complications. There were many months of those yet to come, and a wedding that her father's old solicitor would have found thoroughly irregular, and a chancery entanglement that resolved itself the following spring. But that was the moment she would remember, later. The study, the May light. The elm trees going green outside the window. She reached across the desk and took his hand, and he held it in both of his, as if he had been waiting a reasonable amount of time to do exactly that, and had finally decided the moment was right. She thought her father would have liked him. She thought, for the first time in 6 years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.